Dear colleagues, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this session on 10 years since the Nansen Initiative Protection Agenda, assessing progress and outlooks. My name is Atle Solberg. I'm head of the Secretariat of the Platform on Disaster Displacement, the PDD. That's one of the first acronyms we're introducing today. The PDD, or the Platform on Disaster Displacement, is a state-led initiative. It was launched by the government of Germany and Bangladesh in 2016, and it's currently under the leadership of Costa Rica and the Philippines. Costa Rica holds the chairmanship of the platform. I'm joining you from Geneva, Switzerland, where the Secretariat of the platform is located. Our primary objective as PDD is to enhance the protection of people displaced in the context of disasters and adverse effect of climate change. October 2025 is an important year for us working under the Platform on Disaster Displacement. 10 years ago, 109 states endorsed what is called the Agenda for the Protection of Cross-Border Displaced Persons in the context of disasters and climate change, what I will refer to as the Nansen Initiative Protection Agenda hereinafter. The Nansen Initiative Protection Agenda is a toolbox of different policy instruments or policy tools that can be used to prevent, respond, and avert disaster displacement. It's also a compilation of effective practices that states have used to better protect people displaced in the context of disaster and adverse effect of climate change, but also to reduce the risk of disaster displacement. A key objective of the work of the Platform on Disaster Displacement is to support the implementation of the Nansen Initiative Protection Agenda. So this session will have a focus on the Nansen Initiative Protection Agenda. We will learn about what is the Nansen Initiative Protection Agenda. We will try to assess progress that has been implemented since 2015, and we will also discuss some of the current challenges and how we can overcome these challenges. The relevance of the protection agenda has never been higher. We know that the number of people displaced in the context of disasters and adverse effect of climate change is high. The Internal Displacement Monitoring Center estimated that around 45 million people were displaced in the context of disaster and adverse effect of climate change last year, most of them related to or weather-related disasters. We also know that many communities and many places are reaching the limitation of adapting or reducing the risk of the adverse effect of climate change. So we are likely to see more losses and damages and more displacement in the future. We also know that with high likelihood in the context of global warming, more people will be compelled to move or be moving in the context of drought, desertification, and other natural hazards. And finally, we also know that the multilateral system and the United Nations are facing some major challenges as we speak. Some of them are related to financing for the work of the multilateral system, but there's also question marks around the commitment to agreed upon standards and policy commitment from the past. So there is evidently more to do, and we all have to scale up our efforts. We are very happy to, and we want to congratulate the Western Michigan University for convening us of this Migration Symposium, and also to partner them in this session. So in short, we would like to take stock of progress and what has happened in the area of disaster displacement and the work of the protection agenda since 2015. We will look at some of the remaining gaps across different policy areas, and then finally discuss how we strategically can overcome some of the challenges we are facing as of today. We have a great panel with us today. I will introduce them as we go. And what we plan to do is to have for approximately 60 minutes of intervention from the panel, followed by 30 minutes of question and answer from you as participants. And you can put your questions into the question and answer function of the Zoom tool, but also raise your hands. And there are technical backstop support to help us identify that. And you also have the opportunity to unmute or put on your video, but we can come back to that. So to repeat a little the proceeding of this session, we will have one keynote speaker, then we will follow by a panel with 2 rounds of question and answers. We hope to keep that to about 60 minutes, and then we will open up for question and answer from you as participants. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to our keynote speaker, Professor Walter Kehlin, who currently holds the envoyship of the Platform on Disaster Displacement. And as I said, the chair of the platform is currently the government of Costa Rica. Professor Kehlin was also the envoy of the chairmanship of the Nansen initiative process, which was launched by Norway and Switzerland in 2012. So he is really the person that can introduce us to some of the basics of the Nansen Initiative Protection Agenda and some of the background. So Professor Kehlin, maybe you can put also on your professor hat and let us know and tell us a little about what's the background for the Nansen Initiative Protection Agenda, what is its content, and how do you see its relevance as of today? So Professor Kehlin, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Atle. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Yes, what's the background and what's the content of this document? What is its character? As was mentioned 10 years ago, this document was adopted, endorsed by more than 100 states at a meeting in Geneva. This was a time, of course, when everyone was very optimistic. And this has probably changed rather fundamentally now at a time when even some of the world leaders are denying that there is climate change, human-made, human-induced climate change. So where do we stand? What do we have achieved? In fact, we have achieved a lot in these 10 years. And I think it's progress that cannot be easily dismantled. But let's go back not 10 years, let's go back 15 years. This is when the whole thing started. In 2010, at one of the global conferences on climate change, COP16 in Cancun, Mexico, at that conference, states adopted what is called the Cancun Climate Change Adaptation Framework. And it contains an important but very short 5-line paragraph, basically saying that planned relocation, predominantly migration, and in particular forced displacement are among the challenges of adapting to the impacts of climate change. This was an important statement, but climate negotiators probably were not the best placed to really make sense of this, make something practical, tangible out of that short paragraph. It was therefore that 1 year later, the then High Commissioner for Refugees, Antonio Guterres, now the Secretary General of the United Nations, took the initiative and started a discussion within the UN that didn't go so well, because at the end of the year, governments told him, no, it's too sensitive. We don't want to discuss it within the framework of the UN. And it was at that time when 2 countries, Norway and Switzerland, stood up and said, okay, we see it's very difficult to build consensus on such a sensitive issue. Let's take it out of the UN. Let's start to talk to those most affected, and let's try to build consensus bottom up. This led to the launch of the Nansen Initiative in 2012, a state-led process a group of a bit less than 20 states coming together, driving it, affected states, states from the global north, but multi-stakeholder process involving international organizations, civil society, but also affected communities. And what we did was a series of regional consultations in different parts of the world, from the Pacific to Central America to South Asia, the Horn of Africa, and others. And what came out of it was, in fact, consensus on key issues. And this consensus was formalized in the document that we call the Nansen Initiative Protection Agenda, an agenda for the protection of people displaced across borders in the context of disasters and adverse effects of climate change. And 109 out of 110 states participating in this last global consultation that endorsed the document showed, yes, it was a broad consensus. But what does the agenda say? It's not a kind of mini convention or something like that. It simply compiles a series of effective practices to protect people displaced across borders. It says that in a few instances, but very rare, actually, the refugee law, the Refugee Convention of 1951, the African Refugee Convention are a good tool to protect people. But as I said, that's quite exceptional. The agenda also identified as a good practice the use of international human rights law. For instance, it said that the right to life may prohibit deportation to a country where, in the context of disasters, adverse effects, the life of people might be endangered. This was very much contested at that time. But just this summer, the International Court of Justice, the highest world court, agreed, yes, in fact, these human rights can provide protection against forcible return. But again, these are relatively limited cases. We will hear more about that in the course of this panel. What we identified as a very widespread practice was states that admit people in such situations based on humanitarian considerations, humanitarian visa or temporary protection, a tool that is widely used in the Americas. We also saw that agreements on the free movement of persons can help people to access a country of refuge, a practice more widespread in Africa. But then the protection agenda also does identify effective practices to prevent disaster, climate change related displacement, to reduce such displacement risks, and to manage displacement in countries of origin, even including when people are becoming internally displaced persons. And again, we hear about disaster risk reduction, we hear about tools like planned relocation and the protection of internally displaced persons in the course of this panel. And then the agenda as an agenda also sets some tasks to work more on data and knowledge, to enhance the use of protection measures, to strengthen the management of disaster displacement risks as 3 priority areas. This overview of the content indicates very clearly that we're talking about a really cross-cutting issue, an issue that must be addressed by policies in areas such diverse as climate change, migration, human rights, disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, etc. And what of course is needed that these policy areas, each working on their own topic, but they are coming up with approaches that are coherent, that complement each other. And I think this is what has been achieved. And one reason why it was achieved probably had to do with the way how we conceptualized displacement in the context of disasters and adverse effects of climate change. We were not talking about climate refugees. We said people are displaced when they are exposed to a natural hazard, very often a climate hazard, but also can be a geophysical hazard, and when they are too vulnerable, when they don't have the capacity to withstand the impacts. The beauty of this way to conceptualize displacement is that it provides entry points for policy making. We can try to reduce the hazard. This is mitigation. This is the reduction of the emission of greenhouse gases, the implementation of the Paris Agreement, reaching the 1.5 goal. We can try to reduce vulnerability. This is about disaster risk reduction. This is about climate change adaptation, and we can reduce exposure. This is about planned relocation if it's anticipatory and not reacting to what already has happened, and providing migration pathways, safe ways to safety. And if all of that doesn't help, then of course we have to start to protect people, those displaced across borders or those internally displaced. The Nansen Initiative and its successor, the Platform on Disaster Risk Reduction, which was launched by Germany and Bangladesh in 2016, are focusing or were focusing on framing these messages and feeding them into the relevant processes, the relevant policy processes. And I think there we have been quite successful. For instance, even though it was a very contested matter, our states managed in Sendai in 2015 to get human mobility into the Sendai Framework on Disaster Risk Reduction. Contested then, but no longer. Now it's mainstream, now it's universally accepted. The endorsement of the protection agenda happened in October 2015. The next month, all our states that had attended went to Paris. And part of the Paris Agreement and decision was to set up a task force on displacement under the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage. And this has been complemented by a fund for responding to loss and damage, and also by the so-called Santiago network, which provides technical assistance to states. And what is important, all these mechanisms also cover displacement linked to climate change. And that's an institutional setup, still weak, but a very good foundation to build on. And then the Compact on Global Migration. The Compact on Global Migration, adopted by the UN General Assembly in 2018, addresses the need to mitigate adverse effects of climate change. It contains an explicit reference to the protection agenda. It calls for providing people displaced across borders with temporary, or in some cases, even permanent admission. And then lots of work has been happening at the regional levels in the Americas. Last step, last year, the Cartagena Plus 10 Chile Declaration and Action Plan, one of the three pillars, is covering our issue here. The advisory opinion on climate change issued by the Inter-American Court on Human Rights this summer not only references the protection agenda, but goes into detail on how to provide human rights protection to these people. And late in 2023, a process that started with our first consultation on Cook Islands came to the adoption of a Pacific Regional Framework on Climate Mobility. And in Africa, the sub-regional organization in the Horn of Africa, IGAD, not only adopted recently an agreement on the free movement of persons, but for the first time in these agreements included an article saying that people moving in anticipation of, during, and if in the aftermath of disasters can access this free movement, even though the main purpose of this instrument is economic. So things are there, universally recognized, firmly anchored on the international agenda, a lot of policy coherence across silos. But numbers are still increasing. But we still have insufficient data and knowledge in certain areas. But many countries still lack adequate normative institutional frameworks. And financing to support affected countries is a huge challenge. So lots of work to do in these difficult times. Maybe thinking about, again, coalitions of the willing. And this was the character of the Nansen initiative, and is the character of the platform on disaster displacement, are the way ahead in times when multilateralism is becoming so difficult. Bottom-up rather than top-down approaches might work. And with this, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Kaelin. I think you gave an excellent introduction to many entry points on how to address disaster displacement. And maybe what you also talked a little about towards the end is regional opportunities. Maybe at the moment when the global scene is complicated and complex, maybe there are space at the regional, and also the concept of coalition of the willing. You will come back towards the end of this session, Professor Kaelin. I invite you also to listen carefully and also put your questions in the chat if you have any questions as we go forward. So now we will shift a little the modality. We will now have 4 speakers, shorter interventions, and we will do this in rounds. And I'm very happy to introduce you to our next speaker, who is Associate Professor Matthew Scott from the University of Lund in Sweden. And Matthew has also been a long-standing friend of the work of the PDD and the platform. He's a member of our advisory committee, and really giving legal analysis and support into our work. And Matthew, you heard Professor Kaelin talking about how the Nansen initiative somehow also emerged in a discussion about the role of refugee law and international human rights law. And if you allow me, maybe you can walk us a little through, maybe unpack that a little for all of us. What can be the role of international refugee law, regional refugee law, when we talk about protection of people displaced in the context of disaster and the worst effect of climate change? So Matthew, you have the floor, please.
Thanks, Hadley. Thanks to the organizers, and welcome everybody to the session. So I started this process around the time of the launch of the Nansen initiative. I entered academia coming out of legal practice, working in the UK in asylum and immigration. And it seemed to me at the time, following on from a presentation I heard from the former High Commissioner for Human Rights at that time, that climate change was going to be one of the biggest human rights challenges. And I thought somebody needs to look at this situation from a refugee law perspective. And being a practitioner at the time, I thought maybe I could do that. And so with the opportunity to dive into doctoral research, I started doing that. Now, in the short time I've got, what I'd like to do is give a little bit of an overview of the developments that have happened since that time. So what we started with, as Professor Kaelin highlighted, before the entry onto the scene of the Nansen initiative, was a Nansen conference in 2011. And amongst other things, this conference emphasized the existence of a so-called protection gap. So there was a recognition that yeah, maybe refugee law has something to do with this. Certainly, we were talking about climate refugees, but amongst others, the High Commissioner for Refugees was saying that's not a term that exists under international law. It's problematic to use this. But people were also saying, well, we can expect that there will be people who have to flee serious harm in the context of climate change. So what are we going to do about it? And as we've heard from Professor Kalin, the Nansen Initiative was an international state-led response to this, which I've had the honor and privilege to follow and participate in different ways over the time. But I've kept an interest in the parallel dimension and parallel and probably intersecting dimension of the binding international legal obligations that states have under international refugee law and international human rights law. So as we see the policy processes that were outlined, we've also seen a gradual evolution of international protection. That's the term that exists to cover the status that people will apply for and sometimes receive when they cross international borders and don't want to go back home because they're exposed to some kind of serious harm, including disasters and climate change. So as with the rest of international refugee law and the wider protection provided by human rights law, progress happens through a number of different channels, and that includes judicial decisions. It also includes work of academics, as well as the normative standard building that UNHCR is responsible for. And we've seen all three of those helping to move the needle a little bit when it comes to international protection in this context. I want to emphasize first, so we started 2011 with the Nansen conference, recognizing the protection gap. Then we moved to 2013, and I'm going to do a little whistle stop of the 10 years that followed in a short circuit. So it started, I think the most important moment was 2013 and a decision in New Zealand, the New Zealand Immigration and Protection Tribunal, a case called AF Kiribati, which involved an individual who later was highlighted as perhaps the world's first climate refugee in the popular press. His name was Iwayne Taitiota, and he comes from the island of Kiribati in the South Pacific, was in New Zealand and didn't want to go back. And through his lawyer, he advanced an argument saying that international refugee law and international human rights law prohibits returning me to Kiribati because of the harms associated with climate change that I'll be exposed to there. Now, what's important about the decision is not the outcome, because Mr. Taitiota got sent back in the end to Kiribati, but what was critical was the reasoning of the decision of the tribunal, which found that it's not fantasy to suggest that this human rights law and refugee law applies, but rather it's quite possible when you apply these standards as you would in any other case. And that's the critical dimension here, that we'll look at this not imagining climate as an actor of persecution, the harm coming from the environment, but we imagine, as Professor Kalin said, the social context in which people are exposed to discriminatory denials of human rights. So that was a foundational case that ultimately led to a much more prominent case called Taitiota against New Zealand, which was decided by the UN Human Rights Committee in 2019, where, again, this was Mr. Taitiota still arguing his case up through the channels to the highest court or quasi-judicial authority at the UN, where, again, his claim was not successful, but importantly, the Human Rights Committee established in a much more normatively significant way than a New Zealand tribunal that it is indeed possible under human rights law for a person to establish a claim not to get sent back home in that kind of context. And we just heard from this International Court of Justice advisory opinion a reaffirmation of that principle at paragraph 378. So that's kind of a quick trajectory of protection under international human rights law that is now foundational to international law as a whole. Refugee law, and I got maybe 20 seconds to say something about this, is developing more slowly, but we have important normative guidance that came out from the UN High Commissioner for Refugees in 2020. And we have cases, most notably from Italy, and I won't go into the details now, but we actually have people getting recognized as refugees in contexts that are not strange to refugee law practitioners. And in fact, I'm at a conference today in London where there's quite a large number of practitioners talking about this specific issue. So I think I'll leave it there. The developments are happening. They're happening in a way that refugee and human rights law tends to happen, in a kind of normative evolution over time, with some clever legal arguments and interested practitioners. So that's all for now. I'll hand over back to Atle.
Thank you, Matthew. That was great and very specific. And I think this is a good reminder to what Professor Kaelin talked about, the toolbox. We need all tools in the box. And although, if I read you correctly, it's slow evolution, it's happening, with small steps, but there are important foundational progress happening under international human rights law, and also important normative guidance happening under international refugee law. So it's great to have people like yourself to watch that space and work together, and don't underestimate the power of those tools and the power of the law. And I think that was very educational for many of us, at least me not being a non-legal, or I'm not a legal person, a non-legal person. That's very useful. So thank you for that, and for your hard work on international protection. That brings us to our next speaker, and I'm very pleased to introduce you to another friend of the Platform on Disaster Displacement, Paula Gaviria, who's the Special Rapporteur on the human rights of internally displaced person. I do hope Paula can join us. I don't see her. Maybe she's coming in. Yes, now I can see you. So Paula, I know that you're joining us from the United States today. So it's morning for you, and I want to ask you, as we have heard that the Nansen initiative started very much out to look at the cross-border dimension of disaster displacement. But as our work has progressed over the years, we know that most people are internally displaced in the context of disaster. So there is a very strong work, or there's a lot of work to be done on internal displaced person. And you have done some great work together with us, but also as part of your mandate to the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly. So maybe you can tell us a little about how you see the progress in this area of work. We have the last couple of years seen the high-level panel on solution to internal displacement. We have seen the Secretary General Action Agenda, and I think we are in a much better place than 10 years ago, given the attention to internal disaster displacement. But please come in and tell us a little how you view that. Thank you.
No, thank you, Atle, and the rest of the organizers for this very important invitation. And I have to start recognizing the all of the work and all of those whose efforts have brought us to this point. First, Walter Kaelin, obviously you, Atle, and the Platform on Disaster Displacement, all its members present, and all members, because efforts have been, obviously they are concrete and we can see them, and many others that I don't know what to forget, and I'm sure that many others are part of this panel and are part of the participants. So it's quite difficult to speak after Professor Kaelin bringing all this Nansen Protection Initiative to its real essence and bringing it to today. And obviously after Matthew, they have already drawn the general landscape and have clearly shown the key components and developments of and milestones after the Nansen Initiative Protection Agenda. So I want to make some history here as well, go back to 2019. the year where the UN Secretary General established the high-level panel on internal displacement, where I had the pleasure to be a member together with Walter Kaling and Elizabeth Ferris and others, in order to identify concrete recommendations on how to better prevent, respond, and achieve solutions to the global internal displacement crisis. So after consulting more than 12,000 IDPs and host communities and different actors, the final report acknowledged that disasters and climate change interact with other drivers of displacement and resulted in 10 major recommendations. And this included making solutions a priority of national governments in the role as duty bearers, harnessing international financing for solutions, and it urged states to ensure that laws, policies, strategies, action on disaster management and disaster risk reduction address displacement risks more proactively. Following the work of the high-level panel, the Secretary General developed an action agenda on internal displacement that set out steps to better address internal displacement. Then a special advisor on solutions was also designated, and we come to now. So this conversation about the high-level panel permeated the two other areas of the UN system. In 2020, my predecessor, Cecilia Jimenez Damaris, presented a specific report on internal displacement in the context of the slow onset adverse effects of climate change. And I had the opportunity of working together with the PDD and many other partners in my first thematic report, a special rapporteur dedicated to plan relocations in the context of climate change and the adverse effects of climate change. And to help states and other duty bearers navigate these challenges, my report outlined the core elements of a human rights-based approach to plan relocations, saying that states must have compelling reasons, strong evidence, and a clear legal basis to justify any plan relocation. Saying also that relocation must remain a last resort, undertaken only after all reasonable risk reduction and climate adaptation measures had been exhausted, and that states should establish robust legal policy and institutional frameworks to guide relocation processes. And these frameworks also must enable advanced planning, long-term resource allocation, and accountability. And finally, that relocations must respect fundamental human rights, that indigenous peoples in particular must be meaningfully involved in decision-making processes through their free, prior, and informed consent. And the agency, the resilience, and the aspirations of affected persons must be at the center of all decisions, with some other recommendations in particular. And on a related topic, the International Law Commission adopted the final report of the study group on sea level rise in relation to international law. They acknowledge that there is a need to develop legal and practical solutions to better protect persons affected by sea level rise, including those who remain in situ and those who are displaced by it. And some practical tools already exist that we know: mobility agreements, humanitarian visas, that Walter already mentioned. And I am looking forward to seeing what is going to happen next on this regard. And to conclude, I just want to refer to the Chile Declaration and Plan of Action that Walter already mentioned as well. This plan aims to guide states over the next decade through common responses to the challenges faced by refugees, displaced people, and stateless people. And to do that, it addresses three key topics: the protection of people in the move, inclusion and reintegration through sustainable solutions, and the protection in the context of disasters. And they have already come up with a follow-up and a prioritization of this action, plan of action, which I look forward also to follow. And also we have national level experiences that we can talk about them later. Mexico has adopted the climate change law. Panama, with the support from the PDD expert, is developing a tool to address plan relocations in the context of disasters and climate change. So there are many other examples, and I think that, yeah, this is a positive effect also of the achievements since the Nansen initiative was adopted. Atle, thank you so much.
Thank you, Paula. That was great. And again, thank you so much for your hard work, also on putting planning location really at the forefront of some of the conversation. I also wanted to mention that both under the Nansen and the PDD work, we always had a strong relationship to the special rapporteurs, Chaloka, Beani, before Cecilia Jimenez, and now yourselves. And I think a lot of the progress is because we have had such a strong working relationship and mutual support to put the human rights of internally displaced person up front. So congratulations to you. Maybe you want to also, you talked about progress at the national level and the regional level. I think a lot of the spin-off from the Nansen and the work of PDD may be seen at the regional and national level. And you know much better than I, there is a constitutional court sentence in Colombia that also may drive policy progress. So maybe you want to come back to that a bit later. But we are a little behind schedule, so I need to speed up a little, and then I want to go to our next speaker, and that's another friend of the Nansen initiative and the PDD, I hope, if I may, Nina Birkeland. I know her from many years ago, but together with Nina, when she was senior advisor on disaster and climate change with the Norwegian Refugee Council, we did some great work. And particularly, I would like, Nina, to maybe if you could tell the audience and others what we have done under the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. Professor Kelin mentioned that the Sendai framework was adopted even before the Nansen Initiative Protection Agenda was endorsed in March 2015. But you and I know that over the years, the Sendai framework and some spin-off tools have been very important. We have worked together on the Birds into Action, on scorecard, and even under the COVID, we developed virtual tools to do training. So Nina, again, thank you so much for being a friend of the Nansen Initiative Protection Agenda and the PDD, and the great work you have done in many areas, but maybe if you could focus a little on how have you brought DRR, or disaster risk reduction, into the conversation?
No, thank you so much, Atle, and also a big thank you to the Western Michigan University for actually having a full seminar on this issue. I mean, that would never happen 10 years ago when we were having the Nansen Initiative Protection Agenda out. But going back to the Sendai framework on disaster risk reduction, as Professor Walter Kellin mentioned in his introduction, that was put up in 2015. I think it's important to think of that in a very different way than we think about the climate change negotiations, which we know is super sensitive, very political, because it's so many powers, it's so much money, it's so much change, and the climate crisis is huge. The disaster risk reduction work is easier somehow to get progress on because it is a non-negotiated text. So where you hear Matthew Scott talk about how you incremental move ahead in the space around disaster risk reduction, I think we saw many of us that were supporting the platform on disaster displacement that this space to do things. I came from the humanitarian sector where I was used to working when people had fled. Working on disaster risk reduction, you really need to look at how do you prepare for it, how do you prevent it, and not just wait until people are running, but what can you do to prepare for it and reduce it. And what we saw quite clearly a couple of years after the Nansen Initiative Protection Agenda came out, so in 2017, is that there's so many hooks in the Sendai framework talking about human mobility, displacement, migration, refugees, planned relocation, etc. But how can we support the national disaster management agencies to pick it up? Because what we had kind of realized working on this issue, both on a regional level, but also in many countries, is that a lot of those people working on disaster risk reduction, they're like, oh, but of course we need to think about the displacement. And it wasn't like they didn't want it, but they just needed a little bit of kind of help and let us who knew displacement work with those who knew DRR. So simplified what several of us came together, different organizations, and together also with the UN DRR, the United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction Companies organization, was that we tried to basically take the Nansen Initiative Protection Agenda and translate that from the protection perspective into disaster risk reduction language. And it maybe sounds complicated, but a lot of this was to try to say the same things, but in a language and with examples that made sense if you're a disaster risk responder and not a humanitarian protection person. So instead of using a term like protection, we talked about resilience. Of course, it's not exactly the same, but how this supports and helps and build people's capacity to deal with a displacement risk can that be done a lot through the DRR. And I think if you look on disaster risk reduction, more or less every country in the world, they have a national disaster management agency. In the US, you have FEMA, and you can list them from country to country, you have them. And of course, you have the national, you have the local, and the very, very local level. So by getting displacement, getting disaster displacement into that thinking, you had a whole setup of people who could actually work on it without starting to build something different. And I think this has also been very much the success of the Nansen initiative and the platform on disaster displacement. Instead of building something new, is inserting it into things that are already happening and let people who already have work related to displacement help them to do this piece as part of what they're already doing. So in this session, I think we also want to look very much back to what is progress and what has happened since 2015 or since 2011, as Matthew talked about, since 2013 when the Nansen initiative was started. But if you look to the disaster risk reduction in the world, in 2018, there were only 55 countries in the world who had a national disaster reduction policy. 5 years later, in 2023, there are 112 states. And 80% of those states in 23, they had some kind of reference to displacement and human mobility. Of course, there's a long way from having it mentioned to actually things happening. And this is where work we did together in support of PDD, taking kind of literally words into action. We try to then have this translation of the protection agenda so policymakers could see, how do I write displacement into my disaster risk reduction policies and strategies? We made training that was developed both for policymakers, for practitioners, for people who worked on a very local level. And we made checklists and various tools so people could kind of look at it and know where to ask for help without necessarily becoming an expert on things they already had their expertise job in the DRR. And I think when we look at this, we can make many examples of how it has progressed in policy and in some laws, but we still see, and we have a lot of space to work more on the concrete implementation. So how do we continue to do action? And I think this is also where we, hopefully in this seminar, but also throughout this whole bigger seminar, we will see that disaster risk reduction and climate change is coming much closer together as topics. So where that was kind of two very different silos and people, very different people working on it, it's much more together. And as Professor Kellin said, climate change adaptation and DRR is more or less the same in the same space. It's just different terminology and different kind of people being responsible. So again, how do you get all these people to work together when we talk about preventing, preparing for, responding to, and finding solutions to disaster displacement? And I think to end this is in the DRR space, working with the national disaster management agencies and all the civil society organizations who work on this, you can do a lot without waiting for the big decisions in the climate change negotiations or the big legal progress, because you can already do it now. So I think this is where working on DRR helps you to be very pragmatic while you're still principled on enhancing people's protection. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina. That was great, and I really think you made a strong comment, which we should remember is that in many places, if you live in a small island developing state and see global warming in front of you through sea level rise, the distinction between disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation may only be theoretical, and we need to have integrated approach. And I really think that we have great panelists. We have really walking through the different policy options and different tools that can be used from different purposes, whether it's to prevent or to mitigate or to address. I see that we are behind schedule. We had hoped to have 2 rounds of intervention by our panelists, but I don't think we have time for that, because we also want to let you as participants and the audience to ask questions. I just want to let you know that you can, if you're attending this session, you can put your question in the Q&A function on the Zoom. And you can also raise your hand, and you will then be able to unmute or turn on your video if you so wish. So I just want to give you a heads up that before I let the last panelist speak, you can start preparing your Q&A or ask to take the floor. And this is an opportunity to ask Professor Kaelin, ask Associate Professor Matthew Scott, ask Paula Gaviria or Nina or Elisa questions that you may want to ask. And there are no stupid questions. These are complex technical areas. So please feel free to come in and ask any question you want. And if you want to put it in writing, we will read them out for the panelists. So before we go to a more interactive session, I'm very glad to introduce you to Elisa Cagliari. We know Elisa first and foremost in her capacity as member of the executive committee of the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage. And she is one of the 2 champions or one of the parties that are supporting the task force on displacement that we have heard about earlier. Elisa is also affiliated with the Euro-Mediterranean Center on Climate Change, CMCC, and the International Institute for Applied System Analysis, IIASA. So I hope I got that right. And Elisa, this is for you to maybe round up the policy discussion, because Professor Kaelin already mentioned the Cancun Adaptation Framework. I remember in the early days of the Nansen, that was our hook, that was what we used to promote mobility, or how to address mobility challenges in the work under the Framework Convention. But then, as also Professor Kaelin mentioned, in Paris, and that's also 10th anniversary. We shouldn't forget that it's 10 years, almost 10 years since almost universally the Paris Agreement was adopted in Paris in December 2015. And there were major development, both loss and damage was referenced in Article 8. And we had the establishment of the task force on displacement, which has been very much close to our work. So Elisa, I know we really would like to learn from you. How do you see the work under the Framework Convention, and how can we strengthen our work? Because I think Nina mentioned it, that's also a political space that is getting complicated, to say the least. So Elisa, you have the floor.
Yeah, thanks, Atle, and good afternoon, everyone. And thanks again for the opportunity to be part of this fantastic panel. And yes, during the presentations from the colleague, I got the sense that people were referring to the climate space as a bit more difficult than other international forums. And yes, it is the case, I would say. But as you, Atle, said, there's been a lot going on in the past 10 years, especially with the establishment of the task force on displacement, and PDD is part of the task force, together with many other organizations like IOM, ILO, UNDP, and many others that I'm not going to mention now. But I would actually like to take this opportunity to thank the PDD for being part of the TFT and for the great work they have been doing in that space. And just maybe to say a couple of words about the task force on displacement that was established by the decision coming with the Paris Agreement, with a specific task, which was to develop recommendations for integrated approaches to avert, minimize, and address displacement related to the adverse impacts of climate change. And in the climate space, when we say avert, minimize, and address, it's a bit an obscure way to actually say that we need to act before disaster strikes to do our best to mitigate and also to adapt, but also we need to operate in the ex post phase. And these recommendations, you might recall, were adopted at COP24. And if you look at them, you find many elements of the protection agenda. So it's really with us in the climate space. And as I said, the TFD had like a limited mandate at the beginning, but the experience was so successful that now, like 3 weeks ago, we actually gathered the 4th plan of action of the Task Force on Displacement. And much of the work that the TFD has been doing has related to knowledge production. And I maybe just want to mention a key knowledge product that was led by the PDD and that was endorsed and adopted by the WIM EXCOM, which is the technical guide for accessing financial resources, aiming to avert, minimize, and address the impacts of displacement. And there are also other technical guides that are hopefully useful to practitioners out there, like the technical guide on integrated human mobility in national adaptation plans. So we've been working a lot in the loss and damage space on knowledge production, but of course now we're moving to the implementation phase. And as Professor Kaelin mentioned, the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage was established, and at COP30, the startup phase of the fund, which is called the Barbados Implementation Modalities, will be launched. And this is a really important milestone. There will be this call for proposal for developing countries that are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, and they will be able to access grants from the BIM, so the Barbados Implementation Modalities, between 5 to 20 million per intervention. And so the fund is being operationalized and will have an impact on the ground, and this also hopefully provide an opportunity for us in the climate space to strengthen our collaboration also with the humanitarian communities and the organizations that you also represent here today. And another space, and here I conclude, and that was also cited by Professor Kaelin, is the Santiago Network, which was created to catalyze technical assistance for developing countries. And again, it has been operationalized, and there's a first request for technical assistance that was funded, which was filed by Vanuatu. That also includes elements related to human mobility. And so many opportunities to work together in the future. And with this, I give the floor back to you, Atle, for our discussion.
Thank you, Elisa. That was great, and thank you for your leadership also under the work of the Executive Committee of the Warsaw International Mechanism, the WIM EXCOM, as we say in short. Sometimes I want to come back to you. Maybe you can assess your expectation for the next conference of the parties and assess your expectation on the fund and the size of it. There might be questions. I want to give you heads up that I might come back to you, and I also give heads up to all the speakers and panelists that please come prepared to say a little about what do we do now going forward. What do we need to scale up? What do we need to do to come together? Do we need a coalition of the willing? How do we address some of the major data gaps? We have heard about the financing gap, but also the fact that the political commitment may not be as strong, and we know that some countries have announced their withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, for example, which evidently is bad news for a global tool. We have two questions. I also been told by Melissa that you cannot turn on your video, so apologies if I gave an impression for that. But we have one Q&A from Paul Clements, and Paul, you want to come in, and because you can unmute yourself so we can hear your voice, and maybe you can direct that question to some of the speakers. So Paul, you have the floor if you so wish.
Hi, thanks very much. I'm going to have to pull up my question again because I wrote it. Okay, so to any of our speakers, we've heard about many great principles, frameworks, and agreements. I would guess that fewer than 10% of climate displaced persons have received internationally assisted support for rebuilding their lives. In the present resource constrained context, what is the priority for getting this up to 20%? Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. I think that's a question that all of our panelists and speakers can reflect on. We also have hands up, and apologies if I do not pronounce this correctly. Namno Enang, would you like to unmute yourself? We cannot hear you. Maybe you are muted still.
I think you're just very quiet, sort of like a whisper sound. Oh, it's very, very quiet. It's very faint.
Yeah. So maybe Namno, if you wanna put your question into the Q&A, then we can get it. I also invite all our participants. I know some of you, I can go through the list. I'm not gonna put anyone on the spot, but feel free to put the question, unmute yourself, raise your hand. And this is a moment also as a community to come together. How do we strategize again? Strategize together to maybe overcome some of the challenges. I see no activity. I suggest that we have one hand. Matthew, please come in.
Thanks. Yes, it's me. I think I can both offer one response to Paul's question and maybe pass a question also to both Paula and Professor Kalin. The question about how to move from 10% to 20% in terms of people receiving some kind of support. It's maybe because I work in a research and academic context, but I think just as when Professor Kalin was referencing this paragraph 14F from the Cancun Adaptation Framework, I think which called upon parties to cooperate towards developing an understanding of this phenomenon. I think even 10 years on since the adoption of the protection agenda, we still don't know enough about the dynamics, particularly when it comes to the cross-border dimension. There's a real limitation in the research. So part of it is because we don't have mechanisms for kind of counting or recording who's moving across international borders in the context of disasters and climate change. So one way we're trying to deal with that in partnership with a number of organizations, one of the reasons I'm here in London today, is collating judicial decisions to see how law is actually being applied. And an important thing there is to see not only how it works in global north countries. I mentioned Italy, I mentioned New Zealand, there's decisions from Australia and so on. But we really need to see how judicial authorities, as well as states in their governance capacity, are deciding how to address the predicament of people who are seeking to enter and stay in their territory in the context of disasters and climate change. Because it's only then that we will know how to effectively respond. And I think even 10 years on, the cross-border dimension remains underexplored, and we need to see that both from a governance and policy perspective, but also from the legal perspective. And I guess I'm particularly interested in that as well, because I'm starting a research project in 2026 looking at judicial responses to internal disaster displacement. And shifting to internal, you don't have to answer this right now, either Professor Kalin or Paula, but one of the things that the high-level panel emphasized, one of the predominant messages in terms of addressing durable solutions, was this point about political will. And I think the Nansen process has been instrumental in galvanizing political will to some extent, but maybe it'd be interesting to hear a bit more about how to do that going forward. And maybe that's your prompt already, packaged in a different way, Atle. But that's where I'll leave it.
Thank you, Matthew. I think one thing I so much agree with you is that we need to keep up our capacity to monitor. In your case, you mentioned judicial decision, but also monitor policy development. Is there a new legislation? Is there a new strategy? And I think Nina mentioned to that, can we actually talk about progress or regress? And do we know whether these decisions or these policies are good policies? Do they protect people? And I think that's an area where somebody has to do that. I think it's a public good, and we all know that to finance public goods are difficult. So very well noted on that. I see that there are traffic on the Q&A now. I'm so happy for that. But I saw Professor Kalin raised his hand or arm. So Professor Kalin, please come in, and then I'll go back to the Q&A afterwards.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to Paul Clement's question, and also Matthew's question. Of course, the starting point is that the very, very large majority of displaced people in disaster or climate change context remain within their own country. I would say that more than 10% in these situations get some humanitarian support, response, humanitarian assistance during the emergency phase. If you're looking at some of the governments, be it the Philippines, be it Bangladesh, today really have quite efficient management authorities. But the big problem is after the emergency phase. And the question was about how many get support to rebuild their lives. Very few. I've seen that myself in my practical work, that among those internally displaced persons who are in protracted internal displacement, there are many, many, many that have been displaced in disaster, climate change context. And that's where we have a huge problem. The response traditionally has been projects by organizations such as UNHCR and IOM, meaning basically still very much humanitarian or humanitarian-oriented approaches on a project basis. And this didn't work in the past, and now it won't work at all, because we all know that humanitarian funding is collapsing, and the little money that is left goes into life-saving activities, and internal displacement, protracted internal displacement will be neglected. So we do need to look at different approaches. What I think is needed is first to much more link durable solutions to climate change efforts, climate change adaptation efforts, loss and damage activities, meaning bring it out of the humanitarian space into the development space with a strong climate lens. This means two things. First, governments in the lead, because they are responsible for their own people. That's sovereignty as responsibility. And it doesn't really work in conflict context, but you don't have that political dimension in disaster contexts. There usually governments are not proactive, are not doing what they are expected to do, simply because the international support is not there, the financial support is not there. And then some governments say, well, what about climate justice? We didn't cause this problem. So it should be those who are responsible, the main emitters. And in that context, we do have very important new developments. And that's the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice. Because for the first time, it says financing for loss and damage and displacement is a loss for people. It is damaging people's lives. It's not just a moral duty. It is a legal duty. And affected states, communities can claim compensation, monetary compensation. And I think that's a new dimension. But they leave it open. They leave it really to domestic and regional courts on that basis now to develop jurisprudence that would tell us under what circumstances, in what situations, what needs to be shown by claimants, etc. So still a long way to go. But I think this will be one of the main topics in our field during the next 5 years. A lot of judicial activities in this regard. And this is my question to Elisa. What do you think will it mean for the next COP and the COP 1 year later if loss and damage suddenly moves into a different space? Can we expect more financial contributions to the loss and damage fund by states who say, well, maybe that's a good way, or that's a better way to do what we are expected to do, even from a legal perspective, than to have lots of individual cases, court cases, and let's engage there. Yeah, the question is, do you think this will happen, or will it take more time to happen?
Thank you, Professor Kerina. I really want to keep that question warm. Elisa, are you ready to come in on that, or would you like to think about it and come in later?
Maybe I can give a very first, I have a very first reaction. I think that what the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage tries to do is to do things differently. I'm not sure if better or worse, but to try to devise a new way to work on these issues and try to fund those spaces where humanitarian sector had more difficulties to come in, or so it's aimed somehow to plug in the gaps that are existent in the current landscape. Whether it will succeed, I hope so. I mean, there has been a very good response from donors in this respect, but I'm not in a position to say whether, you know, the financial contributions will be scaled up or not because of the situations that we have now. But I think that I also wanted to stress that given that here we're talking about displacement but also relocations and migration more broadly, this is one of the eligible activities of the fund. So there are a number of eligible activities and human mobility is part of that. And I think this is important because it's not a fund that can do whatever, but has identified some key priority areas and wants to do things in a different ways, meaning that it should be through a country-led approach. So it would not be the humanitarian community just to come in from a top-down, but it would be the state to devise a programmatic approach that also can think about the longer run, possibly. But this would be my very first reaction, and I will reflect on it a bit more, and I give the floor back to you, Atle, and to the other speakers.
Thank you so much, Elisa. And sorry to put you on the spot. I just wanted to create some interaction. I see Stephen Myron has a question, and if Melissa can help to unmute Stephen, that would be greatly appreciated. And Stephen is another friend of the PDD and this type of work, and I know that you have been very focused on solution work, so maybe that's what you're going to ask about. But Stephen, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you so much. This is a fantastic panel. Appreciate it very much. So, two things. First, picking up on Paul Clement's question on sort of the gap between great policy, international as well as national, but the gap between that wonderful policy and the actual provision of support and solutions to people on the ground. From my own research and observations, research in Bangladesh, which I'll talk to during a Wednesday panel, it seems to me that a huge problem is that you have people displaced. The humanitarian crisis sort of is dealt with immediately, and then displaced people are left to fend for themselves. They may be registered in government displacement data, or their numbers may be registered. And so, you know, we've got IDMC data, which shows X number of people were displaced in a particular year. But there is no mechanism that captures and registers people who are in need of a solution and who remain displaced, whose displacement hasn't been resolved. And to me, that's like the most glaring gap, where duty bearer responsibilities get sidestepped, and where, you know, speaking to this world that Professor Kalin spoke of in the in light of the ICJ's advisory opinion, no trigger to say that, you know, we have displaced people that are in need of remedy. So that's my first question. Sort of, how do we actually trigger duty bearer responsibilities, both at the state level, but maybe in this broadened view of what a duty bearer needs to become? And then secondly, it's a very specific question, is can we get durable solutions in more formally recognized within the UNFCCC, perhaps starting with WIM and the Task Force on Displacement, by developing a technical guide, or at least including them in existing technical guidelines, because for the most part, they're absent right now. So thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. I put that back to the panelists about, you know, how do we trigger the duty bearer's responsibility, and also more specific about durable solution. Maybe Professor Kalin or Paula would like to see. I know that Paula and Nina, you have your hands up. Namno, and again, apologize if I don't get the name right, tells me that the mic is not working. So you have the floor, and maybe you let me know how you pronounce your name.
Thank you so very much, Atla. Thank you. It's okay. Yeah, you did very well with the name pronunciation. I'm actually, my name is Namno Brown, and I'm from Nigeria. I am also the executive director for Migration Action and Advocacy Foundation, and at a point happened to have been the lead ambassador for the youth ambassadors for the free movement of persons in Africa, where we were, you know, where we had the mandates to sensitize youths and popularize the free movement of persons protocol in Africa, and which exposed me to a lot of migration issues, and as well as climate change. So very quickly, I would just want to ask a question. I'll throw the question to Walter Kalin, because it was when he was speaking that that, you know, came into action or into play in my head. With the years of our work and advocacy around migration, we have seen that the policies that our African leaders sign, you know, goes, you know, just stops at signing, and it gets hold off at the place of ratification and all of that. And you mentioned that the though I just came in towards the end where you were talking about another policy or something that they had signed. And my question is, what is the organization doing to be able to get the African government to basically sign and act upon policies that they have signed, for it to be actionable, for them to take action on it? Because for the policy on the free movement, which you mentioned that it is critical to achieving the climate change issues and mitigating them, we have seen that through the years there has not been anything really done than the signing. The ratification has been kept in a shelf, and nothing has been done about it, and it has kind of, I would say, paralyzed the actualization of that protocol, which is very important when it comes to displacement, because we found out that if the policy on the free movement were to come into action, it will basically help displaced people fare better in the countries or their destination countries, and they'll be able to go in, because you see where people basically move into countries without identity, and they are denied access, or they're denied maybe let's say food and things like that, because they don't have identity, they don't have those basic things that would basically cause say they are citizens of that country. And with the free movement of persons and its provision, allows people to Africans basically to move around Africa freely. So my question still goes, how is the new policy, what is the strategy that is being put in place to make this actionable in the African context? And also to Elisa, about I wanted to ask about funding. You spoke about a certain funding, and how is Africa benefiting from it? And also, how do the young people have a place in what we are discussing in this subject matter? And how are the young people, being that the young people are one of the most vulnerable population in this question? I mean, we have women, we have children, and we have youth. So what is the place of young people in this scenario?
Namno,
yes.
Apologies to interrupt you. We are running a little against time, and I hear two questions in there.
Yes.
Do you have any other question? We need to answer all the questions, and we also need to have a roundup. So apologies for that.
No, that's okay. I think that's just two questions we do. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. These were great questions. And I think the point about implementation is what we talk about all the time. We do see good standards, nice standards, adoption declaration, and it all boils down to, in so many places, how is that implemented? I think that's an excellent, and also the inclusion of other vulnerable groups. So I'll put that back to the panel. We are 7 minutes before the end of this panel. So what I propose, we let the four panelists come in. Paula, you have been very patient. You can go first. Then Nina has been equally patient. She can go second. And then Matthew and Elisa. That will be your final remarks, but also try to answer some of the questions we have heard. And then towards the end, I will then give the floor to Professor Kelling to both answer some of the questions, but also to sum this up. I hope that's okay. So, Paula, apologies to...
No, it's fine. So, sorry, I'm going to mix many of my reactions to some of the questions. I just wanted to say regarding the question that Paul Clements made, just referring to plan relocations, two main points: the need for states to coordinate the response prior to relocation processes, already mentioned by Walter, and the need for comprehensive reparations. So this is something also that was brought by the Inter-American Court about reparations that go beyond monetary compensation, that I think is critical. And also on the humanitarian funding landscape that has dramatically changed, just wanted to bring up the Hamburg call to action, on internal displacement that offers a platform to bring together public and private partners around solutions that I am really looking forward to see how this is going to evolve. And just a brief mention to the Constitutional Court decision, which I also think it's a huge highlight. Finally, Colombia decided that to protect an elderly persons couple that was forced to flee because of repeated flooding, and made an important conclusion saying that the government, the Congress of Colombia, had to design, develop, and enact a comprehensive regulatory framework to address the forced internal displacement due to environmental factors. So I hope that we do it right in Colombia and that we work with you to come up with this important law. And finally, on solutions that was mentioned here, we all know that there was, after the Secretary General's action agenda, a special advisor on solutions, and also trying to mobilize action on protracted displacement and engage development actors, also peace actors, to the conversation. And since then, something that not a lot of people know about, there's an internal displacement solutions fund that also works in contexts where there are climate-related displacements, that I'm looking forward also to make this fund more concrete and impactful to people's lives. I'll leave it there, Atle. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula. Excellent. Nina, please come in.
Yeah, no, thank you. And thank you for all the questions and discussions. I wanted quickly to respond to a woman called Alice, who asked where should NGOs who work on the grassroots level go to connect. And I think in many countries, I don't know in which countries you work, in many countries you have national NGO civil society platforms around DRR, around the climate change negotiations. But I would suggest that one, check with the Platform on Disaster Displacement and the advisory committee, because there are representatives from almost all countries in the world. And I also put in the questions a link to something called CMDP, the Climate Migration Displacement Platform, which is a civil society network. So at least those are two small spaces. But I think what is important is that despite cuts, despite having presidents who don't want to talk about climate and displacement, etc., we have a lot to do to work together on dialogue, collaboration, and to build a platform independent of funding cuts, brands, logos, etc., but really have this community who wants to change things and get us together, try to work on these issues independent of kind of the structural pressure outside, because there will always be space. I remember around Paris, when the US pulled out of the Paris Convention shortly after, many people said it's not the American people who pulls out of the Paris Convention, it's the government. So again, how to always find the entry points in any country, in any community, where you can work together and try to make the change, because it's needed and we can do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dina, also for very concrete recommendation on how to work on these issues despite a constrained context. So Matthew, final words from your side, please.
30 seconds. There's a question in the chat, and I'll address that. It's about the kind of responsibility of predominantly global north states and the ICJ advisory opinion. And I think what I can say there is 2 points. The first is coalition of the willing, as Professor Kalin highlighted. And in that context, there are written submissions from Portugal, Switzerland, El Salvador, and the Solomon Islands addressing the question of cross-border displacement in particular from a fairly positive vantage point. And that's an interesting space to explore, given the really significant success of the Nansen initiative process and the platform on disaster displacement. I think there's something to do there. Secondly, of course, that's not very many countries, and we can see that litigation actually does have an impact. So creative strategic litigation that also builds on the findings of the advisory opinion, talking about the responsibility of the most polluting states and integrating questions about cross-border mobility into legal claims relating to reparations for climate colonialism.
Thank you, Matthew. I think one thing we have come back to is this notion of coalition of the willing. And I also remember from the Nansen, we had this almost tactical approach. We don't start with the spoilers. We start with the friends, and then you work from there. Don't take the tough nut at the startup. So I think that's a good things to take with us forward. Elisa, you have the next to last word after Professor. No, before okay. Professor Kelly.
Yes. Thank you, Atle. So very quickly on the question that was posed on how Africa will benefit from the fund. I mean, the fund will ensure regional balance, so no region will be left behind, but 50% of the resources will go to LDCs and seeds, so to the most vulnerable. And then I think Nina framed it beautifully, how we can work together no matter how. The landscape and the problems and stuff. And just to mention that the task force on displacement is there as a space, and I would be really happy to be able to collect all this energy and work together with all of you. Back to you, Atle.
Thank you. That's a great invitation. We will remember that when we approach the executive committee next time. Thank you. Professor Kelin, not easy to give you the last, or it's easy to give you the last speaking point, but it's not easy for you to summarize this. I think we have heard so much about progress and the challenges, and we have a range of ideas. But over to you to end this session, which has been very rich, and I'm so grateful to all the speakers. But Professor Kelin, what do you say?
Apparently, I have 10 seconds, but I'll take 20. We're moving in the right direction. All have shown and illustrated how much progress, particularly at policy levels, frameworks, we have made. We're moving in the right direction together, in the sense that there is quite amazing coherence between the different policy silos, which doesn't exist in other areas of international law and policy. We're moving in the right direction, right with an S, meaning towards more rights of affected people, be it human rights, be it other legal tools. But we need to move in the direction of implementation. Certainly there are still gaps, but the priority has to be implementation. And finally, we need to move together to ensure that we are not turning back. I think judicial action, strategic litigation helps to do that. I think while presidents and prime ministers and ministers all too often are too far away from realities, it is sometimes very fruitful and possible to engage with authorities at subnational, local levels. And we need also to better integrate displacement into relevant systems, including climate financing, climate action. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kelin. That's great. So I want to thank Professor Kelin. He's the envoy of the chair of the Platform on Disaster Displacement, our 4 great speakers, and also those attending today. I also would like to recognize our partner, and Melissa, I think you have asked for the floor to give some information about the Slido, or did I get that wrong?
No, I will just put up a slide with some directions on how to get back to the lobby.
Yeah, okay. So with that, this session is over. This has been a great 90 minutes, and I wish you all the best in your hard work and working together. And maybe the last word, not turning back. We cannot turning back. We shouldn't do that. So let's take that with us when we go back to our desk now. Thank you so much, and have a nice morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are.